What if your own mind was not your own? What if your most private thoughts, your deepest fears, your most fundamental beliefs could be systematically dismantled, erased, or even replaced by someone else? What if the very essence of who you are, your consciousness, could be stolen, leaving behind a programmable shell? This isn't a question from a dystopian novel. It was a well-funded operational goal for the Central Intelligence Agency. For nearly 2 decades, hidden away in secret labs, dark prisons, university campuses, and ordinary city apartments, the CIA conducted a top-secret, often illegal, and deeply unethical series of human experiments to achieve their ultimate weapon: total and complete control of the human mind. The project was so vast, its methods so depraved, and its crimes so heinous, that in 1973 its director frantically ordered all records to be systematically destroyed. He believed the truth was buried forever in the ashes. But they failed to burn everything. Fragments of the truth survived, hidden in misfiled financial documents and in the scarred memories of its victims. This is the declassified story of Project M. Our story begins not in a laboratory, but in the radioactive ashes of World War II and the frozen paranoia of the early Cold War. American intelligence officials were horrified and mystified by what they had witnessed in the aftermath of the Korean War. They saw decorated American prisoners of war, captured by Chinese and Soviet forces, return home as changed, hollowed-out men. In public debriefings, they would denounce their own country, confessing to elaborate crimes they had not committed, speaking in a flat, emotionless monotone that chilled observers to the bone. The American public was introduced to a terrifying new word: brainwashing, the concept of the Manchurian Candidate, a programmed assassin, a human puppet who could be activated by a trigger word to kill a target, with no memory of their actions leapt from the pages of fiction directly into the top-secret planning sessions at Langley. The CIA, gripped by a profound existential fear, became obsessed with a single, overriding question: had the communists discovered a way to weaponize the human mind? And if so, how could America possibly catch up? Interview, shaped by the brutal, zero-sum logic of the Cold War. They couldn't just defend against this new form of mental warfare. They had to master it first, and they had to do it at any cost. The architect of this dark new chapter was the CIA's own director, Allen Dulles, a legendary spy master who had cut his teeth in the OSS during World War II. Dulles was a man from one of America's most powerful families. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was the Secretary of State. Together, they formed an unprecedented nexus of power. Allen Dulles was a man who believed that in the existential fight against communism, no method was off the table. No moral line was too sacred to cross. To lead this unprecedented initiative, he turned to a man from the agency's most secretive division, Technical Services. His name was Sidney Gottlieb, a brilliant biochemist with a pronounced limp from a clubfoot, a surprising passion for folk dancing, and a consuming, lifelong obsession with poisons, toxins, and exotic drugs. Known within the CIA's inner circle as the poisoner-in-chief, Gottlieb was the man tasked with devising assassination tools for foreign leaders, from poisoned cigars for Fidel Castro to contaminated Hank. But his true passion was the chemistry of the mind itself. In April of 1953, with Dulles's blessing and a virtually unlimited, off-the-books budget, Gottlieb was given command of Project MKUltra, a name that would become synonymous with government-sanctioned horror. His mission was as clear as it was monstrous: to investigate, develop, and weaponize every possible method of controlling human consciousness, to hide its sinister activities from Congress and the American public. The program was designed as a labyrinth of deception. Gottlieb funneled money through front organizations, the most notable being the Human Ecology Fund, a blandly named CIA cutout that then provided grants to respected researchers at universities and hospitals. These scientists were often unaware of who their ultimate benefactor was. They were simply told to conduct research into fields like hypnosis, behavioral modification, or the effects of certain drugs. Gottlieb would then cherry-pick the most promising or most dangerous results for his own operational use. This created a layer of plausible deniability. The CIA wasn't directly performing these unethical experiments. They were merely funding independent academic research. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece of moral abdication, allowing the agency to explore the darkest corners of science without ever getting its own hands dirty, at least not on paper. The project's official sub-projects, detailed in the few financial records that survived the shredder, read like a mad scientist's diary. Under its umbrella, there were 149 distinct sub-projects, operating out of 80 different institutions. They sought a perfect truth serum. They funded research into sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and advanced psychological torture. They studied everything from ancient occult practices to modern subliminal messaging, searching for any possible key to unlock and reprogram the human mind. And at the heart of it all was one recently synthesized and incredibly powerful substance, lysergic diethylamide, better known as LSD. The decision was made. Project MKUltra was moving out of the controlled confines of the laboratory and into the unpredictable landscape of the real world. Sidney Gottlieb and his superiors at the CIA had concluded that to truly understand the power of a substance like LSD, it had to be administered to subjects who had no idea what was about to hit them. They needed to observe the raw, unfiltered effects of the drug on an unsuspecting mind to see how it could be weaponized in a real-world scenario. To do this, they would need a stage, a place where they could conduct their human experiments in complete secrecy, hidden in plain sight. This necessity gave birth to one of the most infamous and depraved sub-projects in the entire MKUltra portfolio, Operation Midnight Climax. Beginning in 1954, the CIA established a series of secret safe houses in New York's Greenwich Village and later in San Francisco's DeGraff Hill. These were not sterile laboratories. They were ordinary apartments, furnished with couches, beds, and cocktail bars, designed to look like a perfectly normal place to bring a guest. This illusion was a crucial part of the experiment. It ensured the subject was relaxed and unguarded, making the sudden, terrifying onset of the drug's effects even more jarring and psychologically disruptive. The bohemian, counterculture atmospheres of these neighborhoods provided the perfect cover. They were transient, artistic communities where unusual behavior was the norm, a place where no one would look twice at strange comings and goings. The CIA's operational method was as simple as it was sinister. They hired prostitutes, often women who were addicts or otherwise vulnerable, and paid them with taxpayer money to act as lures. Their job was to find men, ordinary citizens, tourists, foreign dignitaries, anyone at local bars, and bring them back to the CIA's bug department for a drink. Once inside, the unsuspecting John would be dosed with a potent hit of LSD, secretly administered by the prostitute into his cocktail. The goal was to see if the drug could be used to loosen a man's tongue, making him reveal secrets during conversation. But it was also a cold-blooded study in psychological collapse. Behind a one-way mirror in a hidden observation room, a team of CIA agents would be waiting. They sat in the dark with notebooks and rolling tape recorders, sometimes drinking cocktails themselves as they watched and listened to every moment of the terrifying ordeal that was about to unfold. What they observed was a theater of horrors. They took meticulous notes as their unwitting subjects, with LSD coursing through their veins, descended into various states of paranoia, terror, and psychological breakdown. Men who had walked in for a quiet drink were suddenly plunged into a waking nightmare they could not comprehend. Their defenses would crumble. Their egos would dissolve. Some would confess their deepest secrets, insecurities, and sexual fantasies. Others would become violent or curl up in a corner, weeping uncontrollably as they were tormented by powerful hallucinations of monsters and demons. All of it was recorded. The agents monitored the subject's every word, their every gesture, analyzing their psychological breaking points. For Gottlieb, this was invaluable data, a library of human misery he could study to perfect his methods. But for the dozens, perhaps hundreds of men who were lured into these apartments over the years, it was a night of terror that could leave them with permanent psychological scars, a traumatic memory they could never fully explain or understand. Their lives were considered disposable, their sanity irrelevant in the CIA's ruthless pursuit of a weapon of absolute control. Operation Midnight Climax was just the tip of the iceberg. The program's tentacles reached into the darkest corners of American society, preying on the most vulnerable. Gottlieb and his team set up experiments in federal prisons, where inmates were seen as the perfect captive test subjects. In the Atlanta penitentiary, for instance, notorious Boston gangster Whitey Bulger was one of hundreds of inmates who volunteered for what they were told was a study to find a cure for schizophrenia. In exchange for a reduced sentence, they were given LSD every day for over a year. Bulger would later describe it as an experience of nightmarish horror that drove him to the edge of insanity and taught him new methods of psychological manipulation. The program also targeted patients in mental hospitals, where doctors, funded by CIA front organizations, administered a cocktail of psychoactive drugs and performed torturous experiments, like prolonged sensory deprivation and electroshock therapy on patients without their consent. Drug addicts at federal rehabilitation centers were also targeted. In one program, African American addicts in Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. These were people on the margins of society, individuals whose claims of being drugged by government agents would be easily dismissed as the ravings of the unwell, the criminal, or the unreliable. They were the perfect victims because they had no voice. This dark chapter also had its own body count. The most famous case is that of Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist and bioweapons expert who was also working with the CIA. In 1953, during a retreat, Sidney Gottlieb decided to secretly dose Olson and a group of other scientists by spiking their after-dinner drinks with LSD. Olson, who had a history of depression and was reportedly having moral doubts about his bioweapons work, reacted badly to the drug. A week later, he plunged to his death from the window of his 10th-floor New York hotel room. The CIA quickly covered it up, telling his family it was a tragic suicide. For 20 years, the truth remained hidden, until the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s exposed the fact that he had been an unwitting participant in an MKUltra experiment. The case was officially ruled a suicide, but Olson's family has maintained for decades that it was a murder, that he was eliminated because he knew too much. Despite the depravity, Gottlieb's primary goal remained elusive. LSD was too unpredictable. Instead of creating compliant, programmable agents, it created chaos. A person's reaction could vary wildly from one trip to the next. The project was a stunning success in ruining lives, but a dismal failure at controlling them. For Sidney Gottlieb, this wasn't the end of the mission. It was a sign that he needed to break the mind, not just chemically, but physically. The search for the ultimate mind control weapon would now lead him down an even darker path, into the realm of psychological and physical torture. The failure of LSD to produce a predictable, controllable agent was a major setback for Sidney Gottlieb. But it did not end his quest. Instead, it led him and his superiors at the CIA to a far more sinister conclusion. If a subject's existing mind and personality were too resilient to be chemically overwritten, then perhaps they first had to be completely destroyed. The new theory was that a human consciousness had to be systematically broken down, erased, and reduced to a blank slate, a condition of utter helplessness and dependency. Only then, they believed, could a new personality, a new set of memories, a new commands, be programmed into the resulting void. To test this horrifying hypothesis, Gottlieb didn't need a drug dealer. He needed a monster. And he found one in the form of one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. His name was Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron, a Scottish-born doctor who was, at the time, the director of the prestigious Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, and the president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations. Publicly, Dr. Cameron was a celebrated physician. Privately, he was the recipient of a secret CIA grant, funneled through the Human Ecology Fund, to carry out MKUltra as Subproject 68. Cameron had his own brutal theories he called depatterning, and psychic driving. He believed that the root of mental illness was faulty learned behaviors, and the only way to cure a patient was to completely obliterate their memory and personality. The CIA saw his theories as the perfect potential method for creating their blank slate agent. And so, from 1957 to 1964, Cameron turned his psychiatric hospital into a chamber of horrors, using dozens of unwitting Canadian patients as his test subjects. These were not hardened criminals or enemy spies. They were ordinary people who had checked into the Institute for mild conditions like anxiety, postpartum depression, or even just marital troubles. They trusted him to heal them. Instead, he systematically destroyed them. Cameron's depatterning technique was a 3-stage process of sustained torture. The first stage was a series of massive high-voltage electroshock treatments, administered 2 to 3 times a day, at levels 30 to 40 times the normal therapeutic intensity. The goal was not to treat depression. It was to induce a severe, prolonged convulsion that would wipe the brain's memory banks clean. The second stage was to place the now confused and terrified patient into a drug-induced coma, which could last for weeks, sometimes even months. The final stage was what he called psychic driving. While the patient was trapped in this twilight state, heavily sedated and isolated, a speaker would be hidden inside their pillow. For up to 16 hours a day, a looped audio message would be played over and over again. Sometimes it was a simple, repetitive noise. Other times, it was a recorded command or statement, an attempt to burn a new idea into the patient's shattered psyche. The results were catastrophic and permanent. Patients who had walked into the hospital with mild neuroses emerged as shells of their former selves. They suffered from severe, permanent amnesia, unable to remember their own children, their spouses, or their past lives. Many were reduced to a childlike state, having to be retaught basic skills like how to use a toilet or how to dress themselves. For the CIA, this was not a tragic side effect. It was a stunning success. Dr. Cameron had proven that a human mind could, indeed, be erased. While Cameron was perfecting his methods of destruction, other branches of MKUltra were focused on the ultimate prize, creating the programmed assassin. The holy grail for the CIA was to perfect the Manchurian candidate, a hypnotically programmed courier or killer who could be triggered to perform a complex mission like delivering a secret document or eliminating a high-value target and then have no memory of the event afterward. They conducted countless experiments, combining hypnosis with a cocktail of barbiturates to induce a trance, followed by amphetamines to awaken the subject. They tested whether a person could be hypnotically compelled to perform acts that went against their deepest moral character. Could a law-abiding man be programmed to commit a murder? The declassified records are filled with studies on this very topic, though the operational results remain one of the project's most closely guarded secrets. To support this goal, Sidney Gottlieb's technical division was busy creating the tools for a new kind of deniable assassination. His team developed a vast arsenal of exotic poisons and ingenious delivery systems. They created a powerful poison derived from shellfish that could be frozen into a tiny dart, which could then be fired from a nearly silent pistol. The dart would enter the target's body, melt, and leave behind only a tiny red dot, with the poison causing a fatal heart attack that would be indistinguishable from natural causes. They developed biological agents that could be sprayed onto a person's clothing, causing them to fall gravely ill weeks later. They famously developed a poisoned cigar intended for Fidel Castro, and a ballpoint pen that contained a hypodermic needle so fine a target could be injected with a lethal toxin in a crowded room without ever feeling it. These were not theoretical weapons. They were real, functional tools of assassination, built to be used by an operative who could get close to a target. And the research being done by men like Dr. Ewen Cameron was designed to create the perfect, disposable human delivery system for Gottlieb's poisons. MKUltra was now operating at the absolute peak of its depravity, a sprawling network of secret horrors hidden beneath layers of government denial. But the secrets were too dark, and the number of victims was growing. It was only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, would start asking questions, and the answers would shake the foundations of the American government itself. For 20 years, Project MKUltra operated in the deepest shadows of the American government, a sprawling empire of secret horrors shielded from public view and congressional oversight. But no secret, especially one so vast and depraved, can be kept forever. As the 1960s gave way to the turbulent 1970s, the political climate in America began to change fundamentally. The Vietnam War had shattered the nation's trust in its leaders. The Watergate scandal, brought to light by journalists like Woodward and Bernstein, was exposing a level of presidential corruption that was previously unimaginable. The era of unquestioning faith in government institutions was over. A new generation of journalists and lawmakers, empowered by a public hungry for accountability, began to ask hard questions. They started looking into the dark corners of the national security state, and it was only a matter of time before they stumbled upon the darkest corner of them all. The men who ran MKUltra could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. The walls were closing in. The moment of panic arrived in 1973. Richard Helms, who had been a key architect of the CIA's covert operations during MKUltra's heyday, was now the director of the entire agency. As the Watergate investigations intensified, Helms realized that all of the CIA's most illegal and embarrassing secrets, family jewels, as they were called internally, were at risk of being exposed. At the very top of that list was Helms, a consummate spy master, knew that if the details of the non-consensual human experiments, the torture, and the deaths ever became public, the fallout would be catastrophic, potentially destroying the agency itself. He made a fateful and highly illegal decision. In a secret memo, he ordered all divisions to report any potentially flap-causing activities, and on his direct orders, the head of the Technical Services Division, the division that housed MKUltra, carried out the command to systematically destroy every single file related to the project. Crates upon crates of research notes, experimental results, victim reports, and financial records were shredded and then incinerated. It was a deliberate, criminal act of historical erasure, a desperate attempt to wipe the memory of the government's most evil experiment from existence. Helms believed he had buried the truth forever. He was wrong. In their haste to destroy 2 decades of evidence, the CIA made a critical, bureaucratic mistake. They had destroyed the project files, but they had overlooked a series of related financial records that had been misfiled in a different department. In 1974, a groundbreaking report by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh in the New York Times exposed illegal CIA spying on American anti-war activists. The story caused a public firestorm and led to the creation of a special Senate committee, led by the determined Senator Frank Church of Idaho, tasked with investigating abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies. As the Church Committee's investigators began digging through the CIA's archives, they were met with denial and stonewalling, but eventually they stumbled upon the misfiled financial documents. These records detailed payments being made from a CIA front organization called the Human Ecology Fund to dozens of researchers and institutions. When they pulled on that financial thread, the entire tapestry of MKUltra began to unravel. The records detailed payments to Dr. Ewen Cameron for his depatterning work, funding for the safe houses in San Francisco, and purchase orders for vast quantities of LSD. It was the smoking gun. Richard Helms's cover-up at Failade. The public revelations in 1975 were a bombshell. The idea that the CIA had been conducting LSD mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens was the stuff of the wildest conspiracy theories. Now, it was a confirmed, documented fact, laid bare in the halls of Congress. The hearings were a national spectacle. Victims and their families came forward, finally understanding the source of their unexplained trauma from decades earlier. The family of Frank Olson, the Army scientist who had plunged from a hotel window 20 years earlier, finally learned that he had been secretly drugged by Sidney Gottlieb. President Gerald Ford issued a public apology to the Olson family, and they received a financial settlement, though they maintained he was murdered. In Canada, Dr. Cameron's surviving victims, now known as the Montreal survivors, banded together to sue the CIA, eventually receiving compensation from the Canadian government for the horrors they had endured. The man at the center of it all, Sidney Gottlieb, was called to testify before the Senate. There was no dramatic confession. The poisoner-in-chief, now retired and running a goat farm, was a picture of unrepentant denial. When asked by the senators about the death of Frank Olson, Gottlieb reportedly stared blankly and stated for the record that he had no specific recollection of T. Evans. He defended his life's work as a patriotic necessity in the fight against a ruthless enemy. Thanks to his former boss's destruction of the evidence, Gottlieb escaped any legal consequences for his actions. He was never charged with a crime. The official termination of MKUltra did not end its story. It simply pushed it into a new realm, the quiet, lifelong suffering of its unnamed victims. Beyond the high-profile cases, there were countless individuals who passed through the program's orbit and were left with shattered lives. People who suffered from pseudo-onset paranoia, chronic depression, or complete memory loss, with no rational explanation. Their families watched them decline, never knowing that their loved one's mind had been a secret battleground for the CIA. Because the records were destroyed, it became nearly impossible for these victims to prove what had been done to them. They were denied justice, their pain erased from the official record just as their memories had been. This calculated destruction of evidence was perhaps Sidney Gottlieb's final, most insidious victory. He ensured that the true scale of his atrocities could never be fully measured. The legacy of the program is also seen in the explosion of conspiracy theories that followed its exposure. For the first time, the public had undeniable proof that their government was capable of the very things they had been dismissed as paranoid for believing. MKUltra stands as a terrifying monument to the dangers of unchecked power, a stark reminder that in the name of national security, the line between protecting a nation and preying upon its people can become terrifyingly thin. It forces us to ask a final, chilling question. If this is the evil they were forced to admit, what secrets were they successful in keeping?